Good afternoon, everyone. We are very happy to be hosting Professors Fred Moten and Professor R.A. Judy on today's installment of In Conversation. Our topic is poetry, poeses, and thinking in action. We will be talking largely about Professor Judy's new book, Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poeses and Black, and Professor Moten's All That Beauty, his new collection of, recent collection of poetry. We will, of course, be talking about all kinds of other elements of their work as well. Professor Judy is a professor of literature and comparative literature and cultural studies at the University of Pittsburgh. His research interests include Black critique, the history of ideas, cultural studies, contemporary Arabic literature and thought, political philosophy, epistemology, and poetics. He is the author of Disforming the American Canon, the Afro-Arabic American Slave Narrative. He's edited several volumes of special volumes of Boundary 2. Something to consider for our viewers is the Tunisia dossier, which collects voices from the ground during the Tunisian Revolution, which Professor Judy maintains is ongoing, and which I think we should continue to consider those revolutions and uprisings as part of a project in the making. Professor Moten is the author of several books, including In the Break. And I seem to have lost In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, Houston's Tavern, The Little Edges. These are collections of poetry, and with Stefano Harney of the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning, and Black Study. I won't list all the books. I do think that they are magnificent, all of them, and the more I read of them, the more inspired I feel. Today I'm going to ask both R.A. and Fred to talk about the relationship between poetry, criticism, theory, and performance, art, film, just about everything. Not because I'm trying to be diffuse, but because all of those things come together so magnificently in their work. In line with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with reading two passages, one from Sentient Flesh and one from All That Beauty, and then I'm going to turn it over to both of them to talk about that. From Sentient Flesh. Du Bois is confronted with two fundamental problems of representation. On the one hand, there's the formal challenge of giving an adequate representation of Negro as the figuration of an intelligence that is not epistemological or ontological, but literary, or more precisely, poetic. On the other hand, there's the challenge of representing and studying the Negro as a socioeconomic and political fact that indicates the limits of American power as the vanguard of international finance capitalism. The Negro seems destined to be exterminated under that system as a life form, ill-suited for it. This is the gist of what those in power, such as Nathaniel Shaler, meant by the Negro problem. But then again, Negro denotes the extent to which that power suffers a strange forgetfulness of its humanistic ideals. Of the Coming of John was the first, and given the wide international circulation of the souls of Black folk, best known instance of Du Bois's attempt to tackle both the formal and political problems of representation. What makes the short story stand out from the other essays in the book is the political engagements being a function of the formal experiment. It is the formal performance that achieves its political significance. From the beginning of All That Beauty, and which is called a prefatory note with no distance between A and prefatory. This is Fred. The truth to which criticism has access fades to blur, and we're sorry for our reckless scrutiny. But the study that soils transparency in the rightful belief that it reveals an opacity that's always there need offer no apology to James Baldwin, since it's he who teaches us to look so closely that we see all dark through what we see. Criticism is supposed to let you see through that. Criticism is poetry in this regard. And in this regard, Baldwin is more plus less than either critic or poet or both. He makes us let us look for ourselves and through ourselves till we're besides ourselves. I think that there's a wonderful and sort of beautiful resonance, not just between those two passages, but between the projects. I've seen the two of you in conversation, and I followed some of those conversations, including parts of All That Beauty being read out loud at the dining table by you, Fred. And one of the things that even as a post-colonialist I found is that as I think through these concepts that you put forward, both of you, of fugitivity, of the question, the idea of the Negro, if you want to sign on to the word idea there, R.A., sort of our very grounds of thinking are profoundly shaken, but at the same time, there's such a passionate and wonderful possibility of the poetic and of the aesthetic, of art, at least. I won't call it the aesthetic, in all those performances. And the blurring, I'll borrow that word that you used from Baldwin, Fred, of the lines between criticism, poetry, or performance, which is, I think, in both of your work, a kind of refusal to give up anything, or at least that's how I want to read it, right? So there's refusal, but the refusal is a profoundly generative one because it enables that blur. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to both of you and let you just riff off that. If it's worth riffing off, I don't know.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Sadia. How you doing, Fred?
I'm good. Happy to be here with y'all. Thank you, Sadia, for setting this up.
Indeed, thank you, Sadia. Thank you for setting this up. I don't know how you want to proceed.
Setting us up is about right, but not quite in that sense. Go ahead.
Well, giving us this opportunity to share a conversation we've been having for some time. Mm-hmm. And in that spirit, Fred, I want to follow your lead.
Well, I guess I certainly see and hear the resonances, between those two passages that you read, Sadia, and I think, maybe that those two modalities of figuration that you talk about, R.A., with regard to Du Bois, to see the Negro as, and that's already, I don't even know what their next word should be, to see the Negro as poetic, to see the Negro as poetry, to see the Negro as the manifestation or the embodiment or maybe better even the spirit of a poetic sensibility on the one hand, and then maybe a more hardened sense of the Negro as object. Maybe another way to put it, or maybe the other way, or one of the other ways that Du Bois put that is, in sociology, hesitant as a distinction between two modalities of rhythm, But the point is I feel like with regard to Baldwin, it's certainly, I guess what I was trying to say is that these two modalities of looking, or two modalities of rhythm, of rhythmic attunement with Black folks, let's say. It manifests itself as a distinction between looking at and looking with. That was like a cool cinematic moment. You know, but yeah, this distinction between looking at and looking with. You know, anyway, I'm just throwing some stuff out there to to get us started.
Yeah, well, yeah. Of course, there's a number of things I want to talk to you about. I've got a couple of questions along those lines, and of course, my reading has been of not just all that beauty, which is, you know, really an amazing collection. As Sadia had remarked to you before we started recording, you know, I've been reading, and I've been struck by its rhythms. But I want to get back to that a bit later. What I also want to engage is Black and blur. And there's a particular passage I want to ask you about, if you don't mind. It's a complicated passage, so it's got to be a complicated asking. But it sort of speaks to at least what for me at stake in not just that passage that Sadia read from Sentient Flesh, but overall. And what's at stake is the question of what you call, what I call the rhythmic attitude, right? And what I call a kind of global or planetary rhythmic attitude. And what you remark or shout out about in Black and Blur as the new international of rhythmic feelings. Now, what I want to focus on really is a footnote, but the footnote I want to contextualize, right? It's your exploration of the let's call it the intriguing rhythmic movement between Mingus and Ornette Coleman, right? And the ways in which rhythm is a fundamental issue of Mingus's denigration of Coleman, right? He's a calypso player. And of course, you've already framed that in the context of Lord Invader's critique of Fabius in Arkansas that coincides with Mingus's, right? And when you're talking about that relationship between Mingus and Coleman around the issue of temporality, and of course, Mingus' remark is that Coleman, he can't keep time. He can't keep up with chord changes that involve progression, right? For two reasons. One reason you point out is because he comes from a dubious place. You know, even though he's from Texas, the fact that his family is putatively from the Caribbean, and somehow that Caribbeanness prevents him from being able to do this, and the other is technical incompetence. Now, of course, your point here is to problematize a certain discourse that characterizes aspects of US Black culture as exceptionalist. And this is what I want to get at, right? Because in the context of that setup, right? And it's a very interesting setup, and it's a setup in which Mingus doesn't get the final word, right? You've put in motion a ball to ask a question, you know, what's going on here? But you've got a footnote. And I'm sure you know the footnote in question. It's a long footnote, so bear with me.
Can you give us the reference?
It's footnote 3 to chapter 6.
On page?
The footnote's on page 293.
Okay.
Chapter 6 is a chapter that's called the New International Rhythmic Feelings. And you know this footnote 3, right? Paul Gilroy.
It was long.
And I'm going to read a bit of it, bear with me, so that my question or my request of you to elaborate makes some sort of sense. So you remark that I'm sorry, I always get a great kick out of your turns of phrase. One way to think of this essay is as a kind of response to a more recent intervention by Gilroy, Multicultural Double Consciousness and the War on Terror, which appears to have prejudice. But how does one respond to the notion that the African American cultural field constitutes a particularly, indeed, vulgarly provincialist threat to a new Afro-diasporic cosmopolitanism and to more general forms of post-racial national identity, whose imagined conviviality, manifest in the universal desire among a multiracial, multi-ethnic set of people from Britain illegally detained at Guantanamo Bay for Scottish Highland shortbread, depends upon an avoidance of an American model of multiculturalism that is bodied forth in the African American example. To whom is Gilroy speaking? Or in another register by way of another structure of address, directly to him, though I am certain he'll never read this. Who the fuck you talking to? The question is crucial insofar as much of what Gilroy has written in the last decade seems directed toward the great tribunal of rational men, the National Cosmopolitan Star Chamber. I wonder if they listen to him. Gilroy begins by touching on a theoretical problem embedded in the discourse of loss in politics that is currently dominated by the mourning melancholia dichotomy. Now, it's a long note. That, I think, is the gist of it, because you're challenging the naive presumption of Gilroy's cosmopolitanism. You're challenging the presumption of a fundamental difference between the cultural practices that occur within the contiguous 50 states that we call the United States, and cultural practices that occur elsewhere in the Atlantic world, right? Which belong to other populations of Afro descent, where in Gilroy's argument, as you're pointing out, that other group has more interaction amongst itself, right? In a rather multilateral way, and hence is more properly international. Whereas what's going on among the Black Americans, meaning those in the United States, is fundamentally not only provincial, right? But completely circumscribed by the nation and can't go beyond the boundaries of the contiguous 50 states. It's bound by the continent, right? You're challenging that presumption, right? And saying, well, who are you saying this to, and what does it mean to say that Black Americans are somehow written out of this simply because they're Americans? And yet, in your account of Mingus, you're trying to pose some conception of internationalism that also wants to poke at a bit, if I can use that word, poke at a bit, a certain attitude expressed in Mingus of not precisely the provincialism that Gilroy's talking about, right? But at least that foregrounds that there's a problem that has to be addressed of understanding the relationship between a whole series of poetic expressions that are dispersed across a wide geographical space and time. And what does it mean to talk about them as any kind of Blackness, right? That the tension is not one of province versus cosmopolitan, but rather it's a tension that poses the question, what are we talking about? So what I want to try to get you to talk about a bit more is your understanding of what that kind of internationalism looks like. More specifically, your understanding of what are the necessary, if not essential, rhythms entailed in its expression.
Well, man, okay. I'm going to try to talk about this briefly, and I feel badly because I don't believe that that footnote is one of my best moments Um, I I'm I find that, and this is something that we could talk about too, because I mean, I think this is a particular dilemma for Black thought. You know, what I'm getting ready. I think I'm a much better writer and thinker when I'm writing and thinking about stuff that I like. And when I'm writing and thinking out of love rather than out of anger and dislike. And I have, you know, I have admiration for Paul Gilroy. And and I also recognize my indebtedness to Gilroy. It's funny, evidently there's a journalist for the Guardian newspapers in Britain who's writing a big profile of Gilroy. And he contacted me last week. He wanted to interview me about Gilroy, and he explicitly identified me as an enemy or as a antagonist of Gilroy's. And I feel like I spent 20 minutes really trying to explain, my indebtedness to Gilroy, and about 2 minutes trying to explain my divergence from Gilroy. I mean, I remember seeing a friend of mine, fellow graduate student, who I met in the MA program at Berkeley in 1986, I believe, and this was maybe 87. It was the year that Ain't No Black in the Union Jack came out. And this friend of mine who now teaches at UC Riverside, named Keith Harris, I saw him with that book. And I was like, okay, I got to go over across the street, cross Bancroft to the University Press bookstore and get my copy. That was a signal moment for us. And of course, the Black Atlantic was another signal moment for me as a younger scholar at that moment. So he was doing the kind of work that it seemed to me it was totally necessary to do. But by the time, over the course of time, you develop and things change, and maybe he moves in one way and I'm moving in a different way, and totally unaware of each other in a certain sense. There's no reason for him, had never been much reason for him to know anything about what I'm trying to do. But the point is that by the time I began to read and really study some of the later work, the book that was published in the US under the title Against Race, I guess in Britain it was published as Between Camps. And of course that difference is a significant one. In the book on post-colonial melancholy, and in the book on the Du Bois lectures that he gave at Harvard, the title of which is escaping me now. Anyway, but look, I imagine some of this has to do with maybe, like, it was. Sorry, I'm rambling, but I'm getting to a point. So I think 60 to 90 minutes is utterly unrealistic, Sadia, but we have stamina,
Taking that long to clear my throat.
but he, the guy who was interviewing me kept saying, well, he was trying to get me to explain, or to try to give him an explanation of what he thought, of what he kept characterizing as the unwelcome or the refusal of Gilroy's thought in the United States. And I kept going, what the hell are you talking about? Gilroy's work was welcomed and was celebrated in the United States. It was welcomed and celebrated by Black scholars. At least that's my memory of it. The work was embraced, not refused. And if there were moments of disagreement, that disagreement was a function of the welcome, because it was a function of the seriousness with which people took his ideas. Now, what kinds of personal crap he might have had to go to in New Haven, or at Yale, which has never been a friendly place to anybody Black, really, I mean, I don't know about those things, but the point is, I was carefully trying my best to read and engage and take up his work in a serious way. And so what I began to see was this problematic where, okay, so one small detour. There's a really interesting book that I've been reading by a scholar named Raphael Dalleo, D-A-L-L-E-O. I'm not sure where he teaches, and I should, let me look it up so I can say, if I can find it. He teaches at Bucknell University, Raphael Dalleo. And the book, he's authored a couple of different books, but the one I'm reading is called American Imperialism's Undead. I believe it was published in 2016. And it's an analysis and a kind of history of the occupation of Haiti. And what it looks at is the emergence of a specific, and this is of course a specifically Caribbean anti-colonialism that emerges as a response to the U.S. occupation of Haiti, okay, in the second and third and fourth decades of the 20th century. And what I guess I've begun to see is not only the depth, but also the righteousness of Caribbean anger and refusal of American imperialism. That's a part of that chapter from Black and Blur, because part of what emerges from that is in that chapter is a reading and an engagement with the historical accounts, particularly the historical account of Harvey Neptune, of the U.S. Occupation of Trinidad during World War II. So what I guess here's what I'm beginning to think through. Two problematics. One, how is it that Black Americans come to stand in for or represent or embody American imperialism within the discourse of Afro-diasporic thought now? And obviously I find this to be a problematic figuration. You know, I find it to be unjust. Okay? But there's another, you know, and of course, in order to raise that question, to think through that question, we would have to think through the extraordinarily problematic figure of Barack Obama and how he operates within that frame. Okay. But then the other problem that I'm interested in now, and that I would rather talk about without indulging my anger in, you know, what I can't help but characterize as a personal beef or a personal attack, let's say, on Gilroy, which I should not have indulged myself in doing, frankly, in that footnote. I mean, I got mad, you know, and there's a story behind that, but it's no excuse because, anyway. But the point is,
can I interrupt you a minute?
Just one last thing, and then I'll stop. You don't even have to interrupt me. The other problematic that I'm invested in is this. How is it that international conflicts within the diaspora, conflicts between Jamaicans and Barbadians on the one, or the Guyanese and the Grenadans, or the entirety of the Caribbean and the United States, or between Canadians and people from the United States. How is it that those international battles are actually proxies for class struggle internal to those individual places? In other words, how it is that relations between the United States and the Caribbean are actually places where battles within where internal class struggle, internal class dynamics, both in the United States and the Caribbean, or in specific places within the Caribbean, are being played out. Those are the questions that I'm interested in now, and I'll stop.
Those two questions are what I was trying to get at. I saw that in the main text, in the of chapter 6, and also in the footnote, which I must say, I did not read that footnote as an ad hominem attack at all. I thought, on the contrary, it's very balanced. What I found
Well,
interesting.
I meant it to be one.
Well,
so maybe I just didn't do a very good job.
But that is how it comes across. I mean, there is, I mean, RA didn't read the whole thing, but there's more in the footnote too. Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
So that doesn't come across as an ad hominem. In fact, it performs what you just said you were performing with the reporter from The Guardian. But the way you stage those two questions in The Black and the Blur is what I want to push you on talking about a bit more, right? Because the second question of the ways in which the contestations between, Jamaicans and Trinidadians, famously, right? And then Barbadians, let alone what is said about those northern islands that are more in the Atlantic than the Caribbean, is indicative, you said proxy, right? Is indicative of class struggles internal to each space. I'm going to push that a bit because what's remarkable in chapter 6, what's remarkable in the parable you offer of Mingus in his deprecating of Coleman, and you mark this very nicely, Coleman's coming from Texas. What's this attribution that Mingus is giving of his Caribbeanness? In that parable, you're foregrounding that class dynamics in the American context. Because you're doing it very nicely. It's very clear that Mingus's dismissal of Coleman is a kind of complicated replay of city versus country. Complicated because, as you mark, they're both in the category of country. Kansas, Texas, New York by way of LA, right? So both Mingus and Coleman would be marked as country. But it's also interesting the way in which you point out that the discourse with which Mingus works, which is a discourse of a particular kind of musicianship, a particular kind of conservatory musician formation, a particular investment in musical form that Mingus was quite famous for. I like the anecdote of his wife's recounting of when she first met him in this way, right? So it's a complicated presenting of this old story of country versus city because, they're country. And yet he very casually slips this on to Coleman so that there can even be country that's so country because it's outside the country. Mm-hmm. So in that parable, you're showing in the US context precisely the playing out of a class struggle. And in that parable, you're showing the ways in which the international dispute, Caribbean versus US, this time the disputer being a US-based person, is about class, right? And it's about class in a way that goes to the question that, as I said when I first posed this to you a few moments ago, of what's the concept of Blackness at stake, right? What's going on here? And so too, your remarks about Gilroy in the footnote aren't unwarranted. They're not ad hominem. There is that movement since Black Atlantic, right? And it's very clear and explicit of marking a certain entanglement of the Black American project with American imperialism. And this has to do with the whole read of the Cold War, his read of the difference between the circulation of a certain kind of attitude through music versus the circulation of a certain kind of attitude through literary canonization, etc. It's there, right? And it's weak. That is to say, the grounds on which the claim is made are not quite well expressed or articulated. You say it's unfair. One can ask, okay, what's the basis of it? And yet in the same story that you tell about Coleman and Mingus, there is a dynamic that goes on with how the Americans present themselves to the world, right? And even the ways in which, whether Dizzy Gillespie or even Ralph Ellison, they function historically as agents of the American front in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, cultural attachés and all of that. And that was part of the globalization of that culture. So that's there, but that never becomes the clear expression for the charge of the identification of imperialism, right? So what am I saying with all of that? What I want you to talk about is precisely that point of proxiness, or what I want to call kind of indication, right? That in that expression of different structures of class, there's a certain commonness that's occurring. And whether or not that commonness speaks to what might be something like a broad, and forgive the phrase, I don't like it. I'm dissatisfied with it even before I utter it, but I'll use it so we can move along. International conceptualization of Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Right, something along the lines of what I'm trying to do in terms of attending to the forms of expression, right? And the relationships between specific poetic forms and specific attitudes of being in the world together. Right? Mm-hmm. And if it's possible to discern resonances that can warrant grounds for a different way of understanding the world, and I mean now, rethinking the relationship between all of those diasporic populations. And I really don't like this concept of diaspora. It begs the question that we're talking about. But I think you see what I'm trying to get at. And I want you to talk about what are those rhythms, right? Because you talk about it in the chapter precisely in terms of we have to pay attention to the American imperial intervention in the Caribbean. We have to understand the Caribbean response, right?
Mm-hmm. And can I just interject an anecdote, an experience rather, that this exchange is helping me make sense of, right? So it's early 90s, maybe, yeah. And I'm at college at Wellesley. And Wellesley, there is, we have these, I think they were called den mothers or dorm mothers. I've even forgotten what they were. There were these in-house dorm families, right? And so the one at this one, I think it was Schaefer House. I've kind of blanked the entire Wellesley experience. Was she was African-American, and she said to me, when I was going back to Karachi, and I used to go very regularly back then, right? Why do you want to go there? It's so violent. I wouldn't even go to Dorchester. Okay, and I, you know what I mean? And it was like, and I just kind of like looked at her, like, what do you mean? It's my home, right? And we've talked about this even in that other piece I've written, but suddenly you're making sense of it for me, right? Because that mapping of a certain class attitude, an internal class attitude, right? I wouldn't go from Wellesley, the town, to Dorchester, gets somehow visited upon. Well, why would you go to these other spaces that are so violent, right? So I don't know. I hope that's not a non sequitur, but I'm actually beginning to understand it also because as I've been watching, obviously riveted by the Capitol riot, the takeover, right? And I've been watching it as a Pakistani, right? Not just as an American. And I said, and people thought it was just a quip at an MLA panel, that I've never felt so at home, right? And part of what I was saying was, right, and then RA and I were talking about it, and I said, I don't know what it is, and we finally came down to this idea that there was something so honest and naked about that contestation over power, right? And I don't mean honest, and like not all honesty is good, so it's not some valorization of authenticity, which we get too much of, but there was something so, it was so stripped of American innocence. And there I was, and I was watching something that looked terribly, terribly familiar. But then the response was still from some, this is not who we are, right? And then, of course, some people were saying, well, it is who we are, and only mapping it in terms of the internal racial contradictions. But, and I said this even to some people at my institution, because the institutional response was to simply talk about racial healing within America, right? And I'm like, but wait a minute. I mean, what about Chile in 1973? And what about all the coups in Pakistan? And what about Mossaddeq's Iran? And what about Brazil? I mean, how can you look at that scene and not see all of that as well, along with the lost cause and the Civil War and so on, right? So what I'm saying is, in that point, it's not even what's a Black attitude from within at all. It's almost as if a certain kind of liberalism turns to a mea culpa of sorts around race and anti-Blackness in order to maintain its innocence, by completely erasing the imperial. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, so sorry, Fred, I've layered and complicated this even more, and I don't know if this, I mean, you know, anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No. See,
Do you still have some of my question?
Fred doesn't forget anything, come
on. Well, I'm just going to talk, and I hope I I hope I answer, I hope I address both questions. There's so much, and I feel inadequate to even addressing all of it, you know, because I'm a student and I'm trying to read, you know, and I don't have a command of all of these. You know, on the one hand, that essay dates back for me to, I don't know when I originally started working on it, but I think it was 2005, 2004, something like that. And before that, there's an essay that I think is not in Black and Blurb, it's in Stolen Life, called Not in Between. That's on C.L.R. James, and that goes back to more than 20 years. Okay. So so the specific concern with Trinidad goes back to 1989, because that's when I went to Trinidad to visit my friend Stefano Harney and his partner at that time, and went there for Carnival at that time. And you know, it was, when I say all this, I what I'm trying to say is like, you know, I was born and raised in the United States of America. I was educated in the American educational system, which meant that anything I learned about the rest of the world was either an accident or a function of refusal and defiance. Okay. This is an ignorant, backward ass country. It's the most intellectually and politically backward place, I think, in the world, right? It is intellectually and politically underdeveloped, okay? And I was educated in this system. To learn about any other place in the world, again, is a function of accident on the one hand, and what it means, of course, is that insofar as you attempt to learn about the United States within a political and educational and intellectual framework that refuses knowledge about the rest of the world, you don't learn anything about the United States either, right? So this fog, this benightedness, okay, is the framework out of which I emerge, okay? And so a huge part of the, you know, I am attempting to be an agent in my own remediation, okay? Not as a scholar or as a thinker, but just as a person, okay? And that's why, for me, Dalio's book is just a continually important reminder, okay, that there were people under the thumb of this brutal monolith, okay? And that when you look at what happened in the Capitol last week, there are so many different specters that emerge as a function of that event, okay? You say, on the one hand, you feel at home, Sadia, but what you feel, I would venture to guess that to the extent that that kind of political violence seems both more familiar and also at the same time more open, more clear, more honest in some fundamental way, the forms and modalities of political violence that are more familiar to you, being from Karachi, have to be understood in the very specific connections that they have to American imperial power.
Yeah.
That if you say, oh, I know what this is like. I know what this looks like. This looks like a coup. Because I've lived through that shit. And you say, but it's not just, oh, this is familiar to me because I've lived through it. This is familiar to me because I lived through what the United States put me and my country through.
Yes.
We don't see it that way. 9/11 for us never has anything to do with September 11th, 1963 in Santiago, Chile. It only has to do with September 11, 2001 in New York City, right? That's, and the reminders only in a weird way seem to deepen the ignorance, right? Not ameliorate it. Okay. So all of that, that's the backdrop against which what I'm saying takes place. Okay. So I'm trying to learn about about the world. And I'm trying to learn in a way that requires me not just to acknowledge, but to in a certain sense take responsibility for. And this is a dilemma, right? It's a radical existential sort of cosmic unfairness that I, proudly a non-citizen of the fucking country in which I live and in which I was born, still have to take and bear some responsibility for what this country has done, right? I mean, that's a dilemma. It's, like I said, it's a cosmic unfairness, but it also constitutes a chance. And it constitutes a chance precisely for the anti-national international, okay, that RA is calling for, right? That's so we have to take that chance. We have to take that chance.
This is what I was wanting to get at in my remarks to you, to talk a bit more about the constituent elements, right? The constituent rhythms of that anti-national international, right? I mean, of course, you know, Sadia's question allows me to put what I was saying a bit more boldly. When you think of places like Grenada, or you think of places like Panama, right? Not Trinidad during World War II, because we're still dealing with a segregated army, but those countries that were invaded under the Reagan and the Bush administration. Mm-hmm. Or you think about Beirut in the 1980s, right? Or you think about Iraq in 1990, and then again, Iraq in 2002. What you see in each one of those conflagrations, and we've always been in war, is a disproportionate representation of American troops of color. Black, Latino, Native American, Filipino. I was looking at a photograph in the news of the Capitol police officer who was killed. And it was a photograph of one of the units that he served with. I believe it was in Afghanistan. And I did a count, and it was about 21 people in the photo, 15 of whom were people of color, right? The preponderance of whom were Black. Right? Mm-hmm. So if you're in Iraq and you're an Iraqi who's encountering the American police action, invading force, you're encountering a force full of Black people, mm-hmm. right? And you know, that's part of the dilemma you're referring to. It's one of the things that Du Bois wrote about in, I think it was 1942, when he was chastising Americans for not real, Black Americans specifically, right? For their aspiration to join completely the American franchise and not recognizing what America represented for the world at large, which wasn't good. That goes to the question again of what we think are the rhythmic elements of this internationalism, right? And I want to make a remark about perhaps a gesture of recollection or reclaiming, but in the 1960s and 70s, when I came to my maturity, politically and otherwise, and came to my maturity as what we were then called militants. Mm-hmm. A key element of that militancy was identification with the wars of national liberation in the world. Mm-hmm. It was pronouncedly international. Mm-hmm. Right? Now that slips away. And it begins to slip away in very particular moments. And the reasons are very complicated and have to do with economics, have to do with shifting politics domestically, but they go precisely to what you and Sadia are referring to in terms of the dynamic of the formation of persons in the country, right? The production of a particular kind of ignorant population. So how did that get lost? And that comes back to this question that for me is important. What's the way back? And the way back has to do with precisely how we think about Blackness as a point of in common. That is to say, to try to find again some common discourse among disparate populations around the world that are trying to do work, not simply in opposition to the American empire, but to do work in spite of the American empire in an effort to try to generate something. To put it in shorthand, whether or not, one of the things that's missing in Paul Gilroy, you know, Paul's a good friend and I find his work very important, but one of the things that's not, to my mind, sufficiently enough elaborated, and I would want it to be robustly elaborated, is anything akin to what Glissant calls creolization, a conceptualization of being that's inclusive of all different kinds of lines. What I'm trying to get at in Sentient Flesh, in the concept of parasemiosis, right? And in the attended concept of asymptotic. So your criticism, I took as being precisely an occasion for a chance to do something different. What are those rhythms, right? What does it mean to try to address someone like Mingus, right? And push towards that direction as one addresses someone like, let's say, Paul, just as a heuristic, to bring them to the point of trying to imagine a creolite that is robust, right? Which is a real challenge.
Well, part of the challenge, I think, is that this not only process but practice of creolization, or another way to put it would be, and I'm thinking, of course, in the back of my head of several things, but now, you know, Brent Edwards' great book, The Practice of Diaspora, which sometimes I almost want to call it and say, man, why didn't you call it The Practice of Creolization?
Yeah.
You know, but if I think about it now, that practice of creolization, but this, I want to think about the alignment of, well, actually that's, well, another way to put it would be the practice of creolization's alignment with a practice of non-alignment. And I mean non-alignment in the Bandung sense of the term, in a way that connects Pan-Africanism with the non-aligned movement. This is something that that I heard Kojo Eshun and Jonna Comfort talk about, in these very, very brilliant ways, along with Angelica Sagar, you know, who along with Kojo makes up this thing called the Autolith group. But I heard them talk about this in terms of you know, the history of the non-aligned movement. To think about Pan-Africanism as an extension of and as being held within this general non-alignment, but also therefore to think about Pan-Africanism as a modality of social displacement. And then the word creolization becomes reactivated, right? When we think about it in terms of non-alignment, appositionality, okay, displacement, rather than these brutal, vicious, necessarily colonial forms of fictive autochthony, right? that manifest themselves as, you know, really as the basis of the brutalities of that interplay between politics and war. So creolization is this it's a practice of displacement. It's a practice of the refusal of place.
It's a practice of relations.
Well, I know what you mean when you say it that way, and I wouldn't say it that way, you know, but I agree with you, you know, and it's cool to be able to say it in a bunch of different ways, you know. It's like, you know, okay, so a couple of things. One, you know, this is the direction that my reading has been going in the last couple of years, but in an intensified way in the last year, beginning with reading Julia Scott's great book, The Common Wind.
Common Wind, that's a great book.
And then reading the beautiful collection of the great Guyanese thinker and activist Andaya. The collection of her work was edited by Alyssa Trotz, who's a, you know, very brilliant Canadian scholar, you know, Afro-Caribbean Canadian scholar. But that book is called The Point is to Change the World.
Mm-hmm.
And there's beautiful analyses of George Lamming in her work. This is stuff I've been reading along with Stefano, you know. And then, you know, Stefano Harney. And then also reading Martin Carter's poetry, rereading this sort of beautiful convergence of Walter Rodney and Marcus Garvey in the work of Rupert Lewis, right? Just trying to train myself, trying to learn, reading Adam Getachu's great book, World Making After Empire, reading her exchanges with Michael Hanchard, you know, about that book and about his most recent book. So I'm like, this is what I've been sort of digging into the last year and a half. And then also the occasion of teaching a class focused on well, we ended up focusing on some of Sylvia Wynter's earlier work from the late 60s and early 70s. And but the backdrop of it, where things really got intensified, was reading Getachu's review of Orlando Patterson's most recent book, which is called The Confounding Island, which is a kind of half memoir, half analysis of his role in his work in Jamaican politics, you know, under, you know, Michael Manley in the 70s. The reason why I'm bringing all of this up is because, and I'm not trying to claim this as an original insight because it's strictly a function of all the stuff that I've read, but it came to me as a kind of formula. And I believe that rather than thinking about Black America as external to this process, it's important to think about Black America, Black US, I should say, as internal to this process.
Yeah.
And here's the dilemma. How does anti-colonialism, by way of decolonial practice, take on the post-colonial responsibility for administering settler coloniality? Okay. That's the dilemma that we are in. That is the dilemma that I believe that Gilroy is very much invested in trying to understand. And I think that his work, you know, over the last 30 years has been an investigation of this problem. Okay. And what I think he begins to see, and what I think he finds so problematic in US Black culture over the last 30 years, okay, is just this problem. The point, though, of course, is it's a problem in Nigeria, it's a problem in Barbados, it's a problem in Guyana, it's a problem in Jamaica, okay, and it's maybe the place where it's most intensely felt at this moment is that it's a problem in South Africa, okay. What happens when the forces of anti-coloniality take over the governance structures take over settler colonial governmental structures in the interest of their reform, of their better management, but in a way that requires the folks in power to maintain those structures, right? As a matter of something like what we might call subsistence. What forms of betrayal emerge there? How do those structures of betrayal manifest themselves at the level of the intellect, at the level of theory, at the level of the literary? These are these beautiful questions that I believe Andaya is asking by way of George Lamming, right? By way of, a reading of In the Castle of My Skin. But these are questions which we could ask, we could call it the Stacey Abrams question. We could call it the Barack Obama question. We could call it the Kamala Harris question, which becomes totally interesting if we think about her, if we think about her personal history and all of the different places where she's coming from, right? As the daughter of post-colonial intellectuals who then become US immigrant citizens, right? How does that manifest itself in her being, the chief jailer and law enforcement officer in California and running on that record, right? Right? What does it mean for her to take responsibility for the criminal justice system in California, right? On a different level, it's a question, what does it mean, how do we begin to understand the various modalities of Black radicalism that emerge out of U.S. military service for Black folks, at the same time that military service is done in the interest of colonial repression, whether in Vietnam, right, or in Iraq, or in Trinidad, in the way that Harvey Neptune talks about it in his work. You see what I'm saying? It's like these fucked up entanglements, okay, are, and you could talk about this in terms of the university, okay? What does it mean for us as, what we hope to be, radical anti-colonial intellectuals to put ourselves in a position of administering, various forms of various structures within the university, right? These are these problems of it, and I don't believe that these are problems of, these are problematics of betrayal, but they ought not ever be understood simply as the failings of this or that individual subject, or for that matter, this or that national formation.
Here, I'm going to stop you. This is a moment, because I want to address some of the particular things you said, but this is a moment to bring in the lines from All That Beauty that speak directly to what you're saying. Okay? Non-recognition was the world burning. The ice cap started melting in the hold. Anti-Blackness ain't personal, but it is experienced personally. Is such experience real or true? No, it's way more fucked up than the real thing. Ain't nothing like that. As Aretha say, they say something like beautifully nothing, like Marvin and Tammy say they say it. Works of art are to be seen, but art only works if it's seen through till it's gone. Hey, 19.5, no, we got nothing in common. No, we can't talk at all. But when we slide on down, our queerness, our hard, gem-like Black bitchiness, our nothingness is our opacity, our opulent transience, our flame-like opulescent train. Little Rose. So, you see how I'm hearing the echoes of Glisson in this. And you see why, again, I'm pushing all of your analysis is right. I mean, one sees this working very nicely in Haiti in the period from 1805 until 1830. This becomes the dilemma of transformation of all post-colonial states, right? in the name of sustaining the revolution, as well as what we could call sustenance. A police state is put in force. A perpetuation of the structure of global capital is put in force. So a bifurcation, as Tony Bogues points out, occurs within the Haitian context, and there's a number of revolutions. And we see the same bifurcation here with regards to the difference between the document of 76 and the document of 87. And the insurrections like, you know, the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion that played no small role in compelling the document of 1787. This is a big thing, right? It's what Fanon talks about, right? It's the danger of neocolonialism. And it goes again back to this question of the opportunity, right? Because in those moments of rupture, such as the one that Fanon thought he was seeing occurring in the 1960s, in the wars of liberation in Africa, for him, first and foremost of which, but not unique, was that of Algeria. In that rupture, that moment, there's an opportunity to do something else, right? And as we see in his notes from Mali, where he had been sent to open up the Southern Front, he sees the danger and he warns that what must be done is not a reconstitution of what you've alluded to as the settler structure, not a reconstitution of the bourgeois configuration of the state, but the need to try to invent a whole nother discourse. And that's why I keep asking you about the elements, right? The rhythmic elements of this non-national internationalism, because I think in the story that you tell, the parable of Mingus and Coleman, and in the footnote, right? And in the lines that I just read from All That Beauty, that there are aspects of quotidian daily practice, right? And this goes back to the issue of class, that perform, right? Or at least point to the performance and the possibility of doing this something different, right? And the question becomes, what's our relationship to it? And the question becomes, what are their possibilities? I mean, this goes to my investment in Tunisia, Jazair, now in Sudan, and even in Mauritania, we're seeing similar movements, but also in Niger and in Lagos. We're seeing in these various riotous events, let's say, right? Signs of what I call an emergent intelligence. And the question is whether or not we can have any kind of engagement with it, whether or not it can become the articulation of a particular kind of, dare I say, possibility of a different imagining of the world. All right, and even, forgive me, I say this quite cautiously, even a program. So for me, the focus becomes on the engagement with those forms, right? And a very critical, serious engagement with those forms.
Well, there's a theory of Pan-Africanism. And I guess now, and I hope, and I don't mean to suggest that this is something that is purely diasporic as opposed to also African, particularly because of the long millennial history of migration and movement and displacement within Africa, and the new moments in the last half century of modalities of displacement and immigration from Africa, both to all over the world, but particularly towards the United States and Europe. But there's this long history of displacement, this long history of non-alignment, and we could call it, as you suggested before, a history of creolization. Okay, an ongoing history of the refusal of the myth of autochthony. Now, what if it turns out that, okay, part of what you're hearing, look, this is where we're playing a set together now.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm sitting in with you tonight. I'm your side man, okay? And we're getting ready to start the second set, okay? And the first tune we're gonna play in the second set is Sentient Flesh Dancing, okay? And we're gonna play that section of Sentient Flesh Dancing called Juba and the Buzzard Lope play, right? let me state. I'll play the theme. Right. I'm your side man, but let me read the head tonight. Okay. As if in direct rebuttal to Lewis's finding greater pleasure in consuming Negro flesh than dancing, the slaves contested the actualization of that structure of pleasure in the very dances, or frolics, as they were called, encouraged by Douglas's account on the Christmas through New Year holiday. He describes an example of this contention, what he calls Jubilee beating, more generally known as Juba beating or patent Juba. This was the practice of performing complicated polyrhythmic beats, most often 3/4, by simultaneously stomping the feet, hand clapping, and slapping various parts of the body in musical accompaniment to the Juba dance, the polycentric movements of which respond to the patting rhythms. Here now, displacement and non-alignment are understood necessarily in their relation to the polyrhythmic, okay, to the multiply temporal, okay, to the refusal of any simple, okay, Euclidean / Newtonian understanding, okay, of a kind of global and local positioning, which is predicated on a vulgar conception of both time and space. Here, rhythmic displacement is all bound up, it's something that eventually Derrida will come to understand under the rubric of difference, right? As both spacing and also as differing or spacing, but also as deferral, right? Which is his simpler way of understanding this much more radical, much more apocalyptic, much more disruptive, sort of multiple rhythmic temporality, right? That you're describing, and this is it's not so much that this is the investment or the property of the Creole, rather, this is the practice of Creolization, okay? Now, for my money, or for my understanding of it, or whatever, when you talk, the question, how does this develop into a program? Okay. How does this develop into a social program? How does this manifest itself as something like what we might call an aesthetic program? Well, it manifests itself in Mingus's music, in his music.
Yeah, yeah. And
at the same time that his description, his understanding of his music isn't nearly as radical as the actual music itself.
Yeah.
So that essay is like, what if Mingus, how do we move against the grain, and at the same time also by way of Mingus's description of his music, to actually get at the radicality of the music itself. There's moments of amazing insight in which his understanding of a kind of homeless rhythm, right? A kind of polyrhythmic acentrality or non-centrism, right? A sort of non-centric, eccentric polyrhythmic thing. He has beautiful descriptions of that. And then somehow it all gets betrayed by way of his appeal to these fucked up notions of national identity, which are also at the same time fucked up notions of class position, right? Right? His distancing of himself from Ornette Coleman by way of the slur of calling Ornette Coleman a Calypsonian, okay, is a class distancing, as it's a skin color distancing, and it's also this, and he does it by way of this faux national distancing, since, as you say, they're both from Los Angeles by way of various places in the country. Whether it's Texas on the one hand with Coleman, or the desert, Nogales, Arizona, where Mingus was born, as his family was on their way to Los Angeles. So, but then at the same time, there's this beautiful recording, like a song called Los Mariachis, in which he's using calypso rhythms within the context of his engagement with Mexican music, right? And more specifically, with the Afro-diasporic music of Veracruz in Mexico, right? So there's this shit that he's doing, right? Which we have to recover from some of the shit that he's saying. Okay. And then by the same token, there's the beautiful coincidence of an anti-American imperialist project, which Mingus is involved in, at the same time as Lord Invader is also involved in it. And in a weird way, Lord Invader's involvement of it manifests itself both as a refusal of American imperialism, but also in a similar, but in a way, it's a function of, at least in part, contact with insurgent Black American soldiers in Trinidad, who are both doing the business of American imperialism while at the same time fighting the brutal, vicious racism of American imperialism that has put them down there in the first place. This shit's so, all of this is polyrhythmic. All of this is complex. Okay? And now what we have to do is try to understand it. But as you say, in the interest of what our practices now should be.
In the interest of life.
If I may, I want to not lose the rhythm, pick up the theme, right? The betrayal, and let me hit that phrase, right? Let's see what we can do. We can elaborate on it. I'll try to.
It's just because it's the way that Andia uses it that I'm all fascinated by. And again, I wish Stefano's. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, betrayal, right? That and the Mingus is a wonderful heuristic of this. Is the betrayal of exposition, right? The betrayal of critical engagement and analysis, which generally heretofore assumes the imperial posture, right? And in assuming that imperial posture is counter to the very processes that are being put in play that we're talking about here, right? And this is part of what I was getting at in that issue of the Druid, because as you remember, I worked that through to mark a real difference between the episteme, the scientific taxonomy and collection of the collectors of those forms, from Lydia Parrish to Alan Lomax, and the techne poetic, the know-how, which I want to foreground, is a form of critical reflection, right? I want to not allow for the epistemological position, the scientific position in Aristotle's sense, the exclusive claim to reflection, right? But rather think about theory in the ways in which Didier Costa is doing in this wonderful new book he's writing against origins and destinations, to talk about theory as something that is never without object, right? But isn't fixed. It's always in process and movement, which is the way in which Glissant expressly talks about créolité. So the betrayal is trying to engage in some sort of exposition, some sort of techne poetique, right? And this, of course, is what Waheli tries to say that Black study is trying to do, that different way of engaging in theory, which who wrote that great book, African Kings and Black Slaves and Sovereignty?
Herman Bennett.
You know this book. Give me a minute. I'll try to remember.
Fred just said the name.
Herman Bennett.
Herman Bennett, yes. Herman Bennett, right? Who deploys this concept of trying to do theory differently in order to completely reimagine the question of ceremony and sovereignty vis-a-vis what we want to call Africa, right? So that betrayal you're talking about is a betrayal that I think we have to address. What I find interesting in your talking about it is you're marking its historicity, right? And almost its inevitability, but not its necessity, right? So the challenge, which in your parable of Mingus is nicely performed by his wife, right, is to do a different kind of thinking, The challenge is to engage in an act of study, of exposition, of critical work that works with and is a part of what someone called in this brilliant book called Experiments in Exile, Black Sociality. Of course, I'm talking about Laura Harris's book, right? Which is a wonderful performance as well of what we're talking about, at least what I'm talking about. I call it a poetic criticism, which is a trying to think about what are the elemental rhythms that are at play in her juxtaposition of discourses coming out of Brazil, discourses coming out of Trinidad, discourses coming out of America, and aesthetic forms, right? Where the formal is important in a way that we don't talk about it. Because generally when we talk about diaspora, generally when we talk about the world, we talk about it anthropologically. And I'm now going beyond Black studies, right? And in so doing, we talk about it in terms of collection, and we talk about it in terms of some sort of content whereby the form is canceled out. Even those who try to avoid that pitfall, such as the surrealists, I'm thinking of Léris, keep falling back into it. And this goes to what we're talking about, and that's because they're still wedded to a particular conceptualization of what it is to be, what Sylvia Winters calls man in a very particular way. So I think the imperative for Black study is to try to grapple with the betrayal in order to not perpetuate the betrayal. To mark the danger of the betrayal, and hence that's a humbling moment, which calls us to do the hard work of understanding the relationship between form and thinking, form and sociality, which can short circuit the class issues that you're talking about.
No, it's the betrayal is given in the ascendancy, so to speak, from looking with to looking at, or another way to put it, by way of the passage of yours that Sadia read, it's and to link it with Du Bois, it's well, one way to put it would be that it's the betrayal is given in the shift from the rhythmic attitude to the epistemological attitude.
And the trick, the difficulty is to have a critical attitude that is always still rhythmic.
Yeah.
Right? And is polysemiotic in its rhythm. It's polyrhythmic, right? So if, for example, in the passage on the Juba you read from, one of the points that I wanted to focus on is that there is no constitution of indigeneity in this practice among the people who practice it. So when they call it a shout, it's important that that word shout is derived from a particular African use of the Arabic term shout, which refers to a very particular ritual practice in relationship to the Kaaba, that's given that designation within the West African context. There are all of these multiple movements that are going on here, right? And that you can have this kind of invocation of what is associated with a particular kind of monotheistic ritual practice applied to something that is vaguely associated with Christianity, but in the case of Juba and the buzzard lope is very secular, right? So in its performance and in their thinking about its performance, in their naming its performance, this polyrhythmic is going on, right? And it's indeed a different way of thinking. So our challenge is to be critical and still be polyrhythmic, to not make that move from the rhythmic attitude to the epistemic attitude.
It's a critical poetic, or it's a modality of poetic criticism. And yes, but go ahead, son. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to also, since we have also taken it, we're not just talking about the Black diaspora anymore, but also what I want to say, and I think this is very linked up to what both of you are saying right at this moment, right, about the necessity of the polyrhythmic attitude, is to also mark how things that the two of you have said have really forced me to confront a problematic, right, in the post-colonial state, right? And I wish Stefano was here, and I wish Laura was here as well, because it has to do with, that's Laura Harris and Stefano Harney, because One is the notion of fugitivity, which I've been more and more kind of possessed by almost, right? And the other is flying in the abyss, as RA sometimes talk about it, right? All you can do in the abyss is fly, right? But also in the in the ways in which the two of you manifest that rhythmic attitude in your writing, right, in a way that is breaking through the epistemology, right? In one sense, so to come back to Black and Blur, it's the first time I heard you speak, Fred, and you gave that talk on Crisafilli's paintings, and which I think in Black and Blur is called Blue Vespers, right? That was the title of the talk as well. And I remember, so I was hearing all kinds of things in there, and I don't know if you remember, but I sent you an email saying that I could also hear my obsession with the metaphysicals in there. I could hear, Crushaw, and I could hear Donne and my great favorites in some ways. But I could also see and hear something else happening, right? There's this moment at which language is just allowed to do its thing, right? You're doing something with it, but it does its things, and it takes you places where beyond itself almost, right? And I'm not saying I'm not trying to be ineffable here. What I felt was precisely, it was a performance of, and we were experiencing it alongside, right? We were in it with you, of precisely the need for the epistemic break that RA keeps talking about, right? That this is what I felt it, right? And I felt the same way when I finished reading Disforming the American Canon, right? That somehow we'd gotten beyond language as mere inscription, right? But through this kind of meditation on the inscription, where after taking on, and Sentient Flesh has the same effect, taking on this extraordinary history of philosophy without any, the history of mathematics, but without any concession, right? In the sense that there's no, and both of you do this, right? There's no compromise on rigor, right? You've read it all the way through, and you're going to work through the philosophy, so including, all those pages on mathematics that RA has in there, right? And we work through it. You've got to be there. But then something happens, right? And at the end of it, we have actually experienced the epistemic break, and something else seems possible for a moment. Now, so to shift location for a second, I'm thinking about Pakistan and the post-colonial, and this is the question you were asking earlier about the decolonial and the post-colonial, and the settler colonial state, right? The administration of the settler colonial state. So here I am, right? Raised as a good anti-colonial in a national state, right? Where the horizon of the post-colonial is still the nation state, right? And I come across these attitudes, and I hear and fugitivity, and of course I balk, because we want to build institutions, and I do still, that's not the point, right? But then what does the fugitive mean? And I'm thinking about this as a kind of bourgeois product, and I belong to a certain class, right? And and of course, one of the things that's been so effective in the post-colonial state also is the shutting down of all kinds of possibilities coming out beyond the bourgeois, or the attempt to shut down those possibilities. So suddenly, if you take the fugitive, if you take the flying in the abyss, if you take the polyrhythmic attitude, right, and you rethink the colonial state, if you think about Achille Mbembe's On the Post-Colony and the problem of the post-colony, where do we, thinking together, end up? Or maybe not end up, but where do we end up to begin again, or to keep beginning? I think is the way that I find myself thinking about this, because that's no less a question for the Pakistani state today, right? And which is trying to, and I mean, it says something that so much of Black thinking, of Black study, right, and is resonating with so many young intellectuals and thinkers and writers the world over, not just in the Black diaspora, right? So I think that's enough. Yeah, it's an open-ended observation, I hope. Yeah.
Displacement is a condition, as a social condition. is becoming nearly universal. And I am of the view that it will become universal within our lifetime. So, within the next 20 years, the trend is clearly there, right? Of course, we've been talking about it collectively for the past 10 years in terms of the migrant crisis.
Yeah.
But what really underlies that migrant crisis is the fact that our populations are in perpetual movement. And that perpetual movement is very much a function of global financial capital, which isn't going away, right? It's very much a function of the displacement of national markets, right? Or at least the diminishing of national markets in favor of open-ended planetary circulation, right? So it's becoming a condition, being displaced, right? I mean, we can take this back to the crises of desertification in the 1970s in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel, that led to this huge wave that's still there of people coming out of Africa to mark the relationship between the economy and the ecology. Now, even though it's already a social condition for a large segment of the population of the planet, and there are all kinds of orders of displacement, even displacement within very specifically defined national boundaries. Even though it's becoming a condition, we have yet to come to any way of thinking about what that means that is transformative and generative. Hartman and Negri's effort to imagine a sort of global popular uprising is not at all a call for a way of thinking and being as much as it is a sort of prescription for a particular kind of rebellion or resistance. So I think part of the work that's going on in certain quarters of Black studies, because one of the points of what I said to Fred was that Black studies is a contested space, is an effort to try and think this displacement in a way that's generative. There's this argument that's been going on in France for a while now, and it's heated up. And it's very, I think, germane to what we're talking about. Germane both because of its specificity, its particularity, but also how it speaks to these issues. And that's an argument on the one hand between, it's been phrased in terms of those who support secularism or laïcité and those who support post-colonialism and decolonialism as discourses, right? It also plays out of the scandal of negrophobia back at the beginning of this century. And it's a continuing conversation that's going on between, to take up Fred's point about academics, between authorized experts of Africa, the ethnographers and the political experts, and African thinkers themselves. And one of the points of contestation was the recent Declaration of African Human Rights that came out of the Organization of African Unity, that based itself on a document supposedly traced back to the founding of Sundiata's empire, in which the Africanists want to claim it's a fabricated text, missing the point that the Africans are engaged in, which is it possible to articulate from our various expressions and our various practices some conceptualization of the human that relate to discourses of rights. There's one of the fronts of this battle about whether we can think about displacement in a transformative way. And I mention that debate because it is a debate, it's contested, right? So you've got this, I think, important conversation between Jean-Luc Amzel and Suleiman Bachir Dieng in search of Africa, where it's being staged around still the question of, is there such a thing as African philosophy, right? And there's a whole bunch of people doing very interesting work. There's Kwasi Weridu, who are asking really fundamental questions about being in this context. They call it this sort of the second wave of African philosophy, where it's no longer a question of, is there such a thing? But rather it's asking fundamental questions of what is the notion of the person? What is the notion of of the human. What is the notion of freedom? What is the structure of democracy? Is it consensual? Is it majoritarian? And asking these questions in relationship to all kinds of different practices in the continent that generally aren't attended to as possible sources of knowledge, right? These are the sort of scattered areas that I would consider loosely part of Black studies, in which you can see in these moments that I've just cited, a concerted effort to try and think displacement, right? A concerted effort to try to come up with a sort of way of thinking displacement, right? I want to be careful because I've always been very much interested in the questions of epistemology. So when I'm critical of the episteme, I'm critical of the very specific privileging of a certain structure of knowledge, the apophantic, that takes place very early on, and that Aristotle wants to call episteme in the sense of science. I'm not anti-science, on the contrary. I'm critical of a certain kind of scientism that becomes reductive. So when I say that these are ways of thinking displacement, I mean, one could even interpret that to say that there are theories. It's a theorization that's going on. It's the construction of an order or a way of thinking, which I try to articulate in terms of a way of thinking in disorder. That's the gesture of sentient flesh, both in its form and in its theme. Those are my investments in parasemiosis, as I try to lay it out in that work as a sort of point of departure for thinking displacement, and a point of departure for thinking displacement that can think about it in terms of all the different instantiations of it, whether it's the Pakistanis who are in Greece, whether it is the Algerians who are in France, whether it is the Albanians who are in England, whether it is the Hondurans who are in New York, right? That they're engaging in some order of living parasemiotically, some order of living displacement. And I think it is worthwhile to be able to talk about that together.
Yeah, but I want to push that back a little bit further historically, right? Just, I mean, you said the 1970s, but I mean, I think you're right, but I think but if you take even the post-colonial trajectory, I would say that, think about Pakistan itself. It's born of displacement. It is a kind of displacement. It's the ground shifts under you and becomes something else, right? And suddenly in 1947, you have the partition, and you have one of the largest movements of migration, right? Of basically a refugee movement, with people crossing the border in both directions, preceded, as I'm now finding out and arguing or whatever, learning and writing about, the Greek-Turkish population transfer. And of course, I mean, the more one thinks about it, the more it becomes clear that this idea that populations could just be lifted and transferred and moved around, and some moving game on the planet is brought about by the management of life under the kind of the global colonial structure that produces the globe as we know it. And that has everything to do with the movement of Black people, right, in slavery, but then also of all of the subsequent movements of indentured labor that you get in the 18th and 19th century, and in the 19th century, when a certain population of labor is no longer available in the same way, right? So I mean, there's also a history to be told of that displacement, where a consciously managed population movement has become something made normal, but also considered something that should be done by the 20th century, after the World War I, as the imperial shift is occurring towards the United States, which I think we need to really kind of confront that. And I think that bringing together these elements of thinking and these forms of thinking actually enables us to have a much more robust conversation about displacement, precisely the ones you're saying. Yeah?
Arguably, the United States can be considered as coming out of displacement. This is where Fred's attention to betrayal is important. The problem in the examples we're talking about, including Pakistan, is the concerted effort, the amount of energy invested in forgetting displacement. Right? One of the principal instrumentalities of that forgetting is the myth of the state, of the nation state, right? The different structures of legitimacy. And one of the prominent structures of legitimacy is what, Fred, you referred to earlier on in this conversation, and that's the settler, right? The settler structure, where you're not displaced. You're, as Frederick Jackson Turner would say, you're moving in the natural organic trajectory, right? From east to west. And you're arriving. You're occupying and conquering and settling the what used to be called the empty land. Right? That, I want to say, is a story that's told to forget displacement. Right? To forget the condition we have almost as a species of perpetually moving. This is how we came to inhabit the various zones of the planet. Why we're frightened of displacement, I think, is a question we still need to explore. Right? Which is what makes such things as the notion of the establishing of a state. So you know, Pakistan is going to be about displacement of people from one place to another, but when they're put there, there's the investment in making this home, right? This process that Winters calls indigenization, right? What's at stake there? What's the compulsion there? Why is displacement almost universally bad? Why is it a problem of melancholy? Which reminds me, Deeper Blue is the book that you were talking about that Toilroy wrote, where some of these issues are in play. Right? The Harvard lecture.
Yeah. Well,
Deeper.
Darker than blue.
Darker than blue.
A phrase he takes from Curtis Mayfield.
Yeah.
You know, in echo of the various, you know, the deep connection to Mayfield that he talks about, especially, and that he hears in Bob Marley's music. You know, and again, that, well, look, I mean, if the what I think one desires and hears in Glissant's notion of creolization, you know, and what I think Nathaniel Mackey is deeply attuned to in the work of Wilson Harris, especially, and in the work of Kamal Brathwaite, and which he then hears so deeply in Black music as a global phenomenon, you know, and which he then begins to talk about under the rubric of fugitivity. You know, what they're interested in is a practice of displacement. And what they're interested in is what it means to claim displacement, to claim the force of displacement against the grain of a history of forced displacement, where forced displacement is simply the primary modality of governance of the settler. It's the political expression that we then call settlement or the settler colonial. And you know, the phrase that's in my mind, you know, a slight variation on James Joyce at the end of The Dead, is displacement is general all over the world. And it has been. Just like at the end of that story, snow was general all over Ireland, you know. displacement is our common condition. And as you all are, you know, and again, the dilemma that we have is, how do we claim that as our force and our practice against the brutal practices of force that have imposed it upon us, you know? And that's a, you know, and one way to think about it would be, that's where this distinction between the rhythmic attitude and the epistemological attitude has to be activated. And again, you can see that activation in Mingus, right? As a musician, Mingus, I don't even want to say that he embodies the rhythmic attitude, because that would already be wrong. That would be a reduction of what he does. Rather, what Mingus does is he fosters, right? He fosters the rhythmic attitude. Okay, he helps to enact it as a modality of welcome. Okay, as a modality of homeless hospitality, right? And that's the rhythmic structure of his music. But when he succumbs to the epistemological attitude, okay, it takes the form of a paradox. Well, the form that it takes, in my mind, the perfect description of it is the phrase that Derrida uses when he's talking about Fichte in this brilliant little article from, I don't know, the early 90s, called The Ontotheology of National Humanism, right? That's what Mingus engages in. That's another way of describing or of naming the epistemological attitude, right? Which is to say, it's not an accident that the epistemological attitude manifests itself ontotheologically. It's not an accident that the epistemological attitude manifests itself in the paradox of a national humanism, right? Which is the political expression of a certain kind of, again, brutal, phantasmatic autochthony, okay? Literally a manufactured autochthony, you know, so that you can begin, so that people who got, you know, so that which allows, you know, the sons and daughters of immigrants to talk about this place as if they had always been there, right? And allows crazy motherfuckers dressed like fucking Vikings to rampage the Capitol building in the name of taking back our country, without recognizing, of course, that the Capitol was already itself only ever the architectural expression of white mob rule. Okay, you know, white mob rule was happening all day on January 6th. It first took its recognizable, iconic, and customary form as the joint session of Congress. Then it transformed itself into a so-called insurrection. But white mob rule has always been the rule, okay, in this horrible place, okay? So what you know, and one way to think of that white mob rule is that it is the continual refusal, as you say, R.A., of displacement. It is this continual attempt to disavow displacement, okay? And that's what, you know, this is where we live, okay? And to get back to where, you know, we were starting, look, to the extent that the United States maintains hegemony over this hemisphere and in a certain sense over the world, and to the extent that hegemony increasingly only ever manifests itself as militarized brutality, there's no way to do anything other than join everyone else in the rest of the world in calling for an end of this nastiness. Okay. However, what that also requires is a recognition of the force of displacement, of the force of creolization as it manifests itself within this place. Okay. And that means that when we think about a term I never like to use, but I'll use it just because it's easier. When we think about so-called African American culture, what we are always doing is trying to deal with the problematic of this entanglement of the claiming of the force and practice of displacement and what it means to be held within, and also to be drafted in the administration of, okay, forced displacement. And to understand that entanglement, to think through it and with it, places a tremendous ethical demand on the thinker. Okay. And that ethical demand manifests itself as a thinking with, okay, as much as it also manifests itself as a thinking against. Okay. That's what's, you know, and it requires, it means that the intensity of our criticality will have been given by way of our generosity, right? So my anger, so to speak, with Gilroy, okay, my anger with Gilroy was my anger at what I felt to be a failing of his generosity. And of course, the problem is that my anger at the failure of his generosity produced a failure of my own. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to look with Gilroy rather than look at him. I want to be involved in a rhythmic attitude with him rather than be engaged, rather than instantiate an epistemological attitude at or towards him. You know, we have to figure out, we have to ground together, as Walter Rodney said. You know, we have to learn, as Sylvia Wynter says, to sit and talk about a little culture together. together. You know, we have to try to do that. You know, and you know, and obviously we've been talking about that for a while. And
you introduced a concept that I'm going to want to explore for some time now carefully, and that is homeless hospitality. I would say that's a wonderfully oxymoronic phrasing. And of course, the moment you said it, I started thinking right away of the long tradition and protocols of karama, of hospitality in the Arabic language, which also has the resonance or the connotation of generosity. Mm-hmm. And hospitality that's not grounded in the occupation of the space, but is predicated upon a certain understanding of perpetual relationship, right? of the virtual universal condition of being underway, being travelers, and all the vulnerability that comes with that, which is why generosity is called for. But to want to elaborate precisely that homelessness of it, right, which is quite different than an economy of dispensation. It's quite different from, and I would say apositional to, the logic of settler colonialism, right? The logic of citizenship in the nation state that makes ownership, a proprietary claim to a particular space, the basis for being able to share, right? Where it's not sharing, it's dispensation. So I want to thank you for giving me this thought to work on, homeless hospitality. I also like its rhythms.
I want to ask you a question, and maybe this by way of conclusion, I think, although we have so much more to say, which is I want to throw in a term, and I want to know if you experience it as in complete opposition to what you're saying, because I do still want to think about habitation, right? And I found myself using that more and more recently, largely because I'm thinking about um, um, the Greek-Turkish population transfer movement, but also it's something I'm writing about right now. And I found myself using the term in a very particular way. I've used it about, I've talked about Shazia Sikandar's work and how how it's characterized by the profound habitation of wherever she's at any moment. Right. So she goes to Sharjah, she produces work out of that space, but that has to do very much with a relation to that space. Right. And I think of it as very distinct from even the practice of indigenization that the state requires. So I don't think of it as homelessness, but I also don't think of it as ownership of home, right? It's not about property, but the sense that displacement as a whole might be the longue durée of the species, right? The longue durée experience of the species, as opposed to an against the grain of forced displacement. But at the same time, that we need to also have some notion of habitation, which is maybe, and maybe I'm going to have to refine this as explore it as the formation of relations wherever one is, in order to push against a certain fetishization of the exilic attitude in post-colonial studies. And I don't think that when you say homeless, you mean the same as the exilic, no. Right? So I want to think about that hard before we exit, or we can go on.
But if I may, habitation, before you wrap us up, is not at all in opposition to what I think. I know what I'm saying, what I think your is saying as well. I mean, it is to dwell. And it's
that's what I've been talking about. In fact, I've been using the word dwelling. What does it mean to dwell?
Well, in community. Well, that's also part of its etymology, and that dwelling doesn't require propriety.
Okay, so that's so. But where's dwelling with homelessness? Or is homelessness simply a designator of a lack of propriety, the way you're using it?
Well, I'm when I heard Fred say homelessness, I'm thinking of it at a couple of registers, right? I'm of course thinking of it in the philosophical tradition, in the way in which Derrida picks it up as a kind of poking back at Heidegger, and so which is to say a disavowal of the position that knowledge is owned or belongs to any singular unilinear tradition, right? But I'm also thinking of it in terms of movement. I want to be careful here because the losing Watari have some sense of this in their term of nomadism, but I have problems with how they overvalue nomadism and romanticize it. And I'm trying to think of it in practical terms, along the lines of what Taib Salah shows us nicely in his celebrated novel, Mawsum al-Hijr al-Shamal, the season of migration to the north. Mm-hmm. Referring to specific practices. I'm always investigating actualized practices. Yes? Fred?
Oh. No, he's not here.
In actualized practices and the practice of moving from one space to another, always moving, always being in movement. Okay? Or someone I keep quoting and writing, and that's Muhammad Salah Umri's important interview with the writer intellectual Mahmoud al-Mus'adi, the Tunisian, who was the architect of the education system that gave us the Tunisians we have now. And Muhammad Salah cites this important hemstitch from Mutanabbi, ala qalqib, on restless movement, right? Restless movement, and not a movement towards a homeland, not a movement in flight from a homeland. So it's not about exile. but being in movement, as if you were, as if to use El Mahdi's gloss of this, as if you were permanently at home on the back of a camel, right? So dwelling, habitation is not at all in opposition to any of that. It's I think, within the same flow.
Fred, last words, and before we wrap up, I also want to say I'm hoping that Fred, once you've said what you're going to say, you will also allow us to, but right before the end, pick out a poem that you would read for us with us.
Sure. I mean, I think that home is a really truly dangerous idea, whether it is figured as origin or destination, you know. And so
Yeah.
I would always,
Okay.
but I don't believe that home is equivalent to inhabitation. Okay. So as that's just a different way of saying what R.A. was saying with, you know, can we inhabit movement? Can we inhabit an approach? An approach that has neither beginning nor end, basically, you know. And frankly, my understanding of indigeneity is that it manifests itself as just such an approach, just such an inhabitation of movement. You know, I mean, when I think about the relationship between, you know, the sort of unholy alliance of the nation and the human, you know, and that's given in the oxymoronic, seemingly oxymoronic phrase national humanism. I'm thinking about it not only in relation to Derrida, but also in relation to the transfer / displacement of Greeks and Turks. There's, you know, a beautiful book by my friend and colleague here at NYU, Ashley Igsitz. I brutalize her name and I apologize. But it's called Humanism in Ruins.
Yeah.
And what it shows, you know, is precisely that, you know, that forced displacement, you know, in the name of humanism is always the revelation of, you know, of the brutal paradoxes of a national humanism, of a modality of humanism which seems not to be able to declare itself or to articulate itself outside of the structure of nation. And I don't know if there's a modality of humanism that can do that. But I'll be agnostic with regard to that. You know, it doesn't, you know, but what I'm also interested in is a range of books that I think also, you know, move in the wake ultimately of Winter's work, you know, that have explored both from the perspective of you know, Afro-diasporic studies, but also indigenous studies of this interplay between, you know, between Blackness and indigeneity, whether it's Shona Jackson or Mark Rifkin, or Tiffany Lethabo King, and you know, Jody Berg, you know, that this is really important work. And in my mind, I think about it as a very specific conjunction of what for me are the two most important works of poetry in the last 20 years, you know, as in terms of singular books of poetry. And that's Norbesi Phillips' Zong and Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, right? Both of which take up the question of the brutalization of indigeneity on the one hand with Long Soldier, and the brutalities of forced displacement, on the other hand, with regard to the slave trade in the case of Philip. They both take these up by way of legal discourses, right? And that's important too. They both take them up by way of the legal discourses of the state, the juridical brutality of the state, okay, in its relation to accumulative, racialized capitalism. And what they do, but what's interesting, the reason why I think of them as a necessary matched pair is that what it is that Philip does is to show the ruin, okay, that corresponds to forced displacement. And what it is that Long Soldier does, they do both, but what, in a way I would say, Phillips's work, it kind of, what it does is it shows the ruin of forced displacement by way of a poetics of the force of displacement.
Nice.
Nice. Yeah.
And what she does really is she gets about as close in terms of this radicalization of form to anything that we've had in this hemisphere, let's say, in the wake of Ben Ali's diary. That on a formal level, what she's doing in Zong is maybe one way to think about it is maybe, you could almost say that formally, it is the first step forward in the wake of the formal disruption that Ben Ali's diary constitutes. Okay, and this is interesting because it seems to me that, well, what would be cool is to have a conversation between you and see, here's the thing, right? There's this other thing that Disforming the American Canon does, which is, I think, it sets the framework for a specific moment in the history of Black experimental poetics, okay? Because it provides Ben Ali's diary as a new example of what a certain kind of experimental Black poetics can be in this hemisphere. At the level of syntax, at the level of grammar, at the level of typography, okay? And you gave us that, so thanks. Okay, Now, what Long Soldier does in her work, okay, what she does is she says, look, what I'm gonna do is what I'm engaged in is I am also going to try to understand and give a description of the ruination that attends and that follows forced displacement. But I'm going to do so by way of a recovery and an extension and a practice of the force of displacement that manifests itself not just so much in a certain kind of indigenous writing, but that manifests itself in what I would call her extension of a certain kind of indigenous refusal of normative metaphysics. And it plays itself, and which is to say, the modes of geographic and geological thinking, right, that attend normative metaphysics. Okay. She, in other words, what she's doing is, because she's saying, not only am I going to talk about the ways in which people take up the force of displacement, I'm going to talk about the earth as displacement.
Mm.
The mountain is not a place. The mountain is a practice. The mountain is a practice of movement. The earth is moving, right? It goes against, you understand? It's against the grain of the simplistic modalities of global positioning, right? That actually constitute the geographic foundations of settler colonialism. You can't settle the earth, motherfucker, because the earth is in motion. We inhabit that movement, right? And that places an ethical responsibility on us. You don't stomp all over something when it's moving. You don't plant flags on it. Okay. You lightly step with it, in rhythm with it, right? You look with it, not at it. You move with it, right? That's what we've been talking about.
Mhm.
That's what we've been talking about. That's what we're trying to do. Okay.
And
And
I'm
so
sorry, but as you were
no,
speaking, I was thinking habitation as practice was also, or as a practice of living is actually what I was thinking about. Because I mean, I have to say that when I think of, and we can put this with a strikeout through at home, when I think about growing up, right? What I miss, and I've tried to explain this to people, are certain practices that have to do with daily life, right? They have to do, frankly, with things like mixing henna with one's hands, right? And I'm not orientalizing it, I'm not fetishizing it, I'm not aestheticizing the practice. I'm saying that there's and one of the things I find myself returning to, right? And I've thought very hard about this, is really the practices that were still very much alive and still are in Pakistan, of making in everyday life, right? Where you grow things, I mean, there's a kind of connection there to living things. So when you know, at one point I interjected and I said, well, I said life, and then that's what we're talking about in a certain way, or what we're hoping for in a certain way, right? Is about living and life. But anyway, sorry, Fred. Yeah.
We can't be so much caught up in our legitimate, righteous, necessary reaction to their imposition of an epistemological attitude on us that we refuse to pay attention, okay, rhythmically to what we do.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not going to disavow what we do, okay, just because they say bad things about what we do, just because they misunderstand what we do, just because they're seeking to understand it, is always a seeking to place it under the brutal dictates of the carceral and policing understanding. But I'm not going to stop paying attention to what we do and to how we do. I'm not going to disavow our techno poetic thing, right? Just because they don't know how to talk about it, or just because the way they talk about it is meant to capture it. And if that's, look, I believe that I've always, for a long time, means this to me is why, somebody like Baldwin is so important, or Langston Hughes is so important, and they both show up in these very specific ways in all that beauty, because it's like, because they're trying to do how, they're operating at this crucial crux, which is the shift from, okay, how do we formulate an ethical way of looking at Black people? And then all of a sudden, what you see, that what so beautifully animates their writing is that question has, in a certain sense, been foreclosed, and what it has turned into is this practice of, how do I look with Black people? Right? And that's where we at.
That's the challenge. That's the challenge of the moment, right? There's the point of contestation, to consistently look with, and to resist the temptation to either be arrested and give up what we do because of the force of their taxonomy, as you say, or to fall into the trap of their taxonomy as the only way to legitimate what we do. We have to work very hard to keep looking with. Hey is a mountain, as he is a horn that comes from a shift in the river, throat to mouth, followed by Sapa, a kind of black sleek in the rise of both. Remember, Hey Sapa is not a black hill, not Paha Sapa, by any name you call it. When it lives in past tense, one would say it was not red horn either, was not a rider on horse on mount, and did not lead a cavalry down the river and bend, not decoy to ambush, and knee buckle to 10 or 20, perhaps every horse face in water. Its rank is a mountain and must live as a mountain, as a black horn does from base to black horn tip. See it as you come, you approach. To remember it, this is like gravel. That's where
there's nothing more beautiful in contemporary poetry than that. And so, Sadia, I'm actually going to say that I'm not going to read anything from all that beauty because I can't follow that, and that shouldn't be followed.
Okay.
Let us stop with
that was long.
Layli Long.
That was Long Soldier. Whereas,
Yes.
That's yeah.
So thank you very much to both of you. I hope we can do this again. I want to say to our audience, we are very lucky to have RA and Fred with us today, but we're also very lucky to have them as part of our collaborative Ideas and Futures. We're hoping that more things will come of the various conversations that we undertake with each other and with others. We invite people to reach out to us. You can see it on below on the submissions page. If you want to conduct a conversation with someone, feel free to pitch it to us. You can record it and we will put it up on the EAT platform. We invite more people who want to think with each other and hope that our platform can become a place where we can host more and more people. We are quite minimal in our editorial strictures, in fact, and we believe in respecting people's voices and the forms they bring to us. Thank you both, and I don't think there's much more to say.
thank you.
Shout out to Lorenzo Moten, who was accompanying us with his dance.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Lorenzo. Yes. Ronald, you were saying something? All right.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Stop the recording.